Welcome to NucleCast, the official podcast of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Each week, we bring you leading experts for a lively discussion on topics related to strategic nuclear deterrence. Our host is Dr. Adam Lowther, Director of Strategic Programs at the National Strategic Research Institute. The views of the hosts and the guests are their own.
Welcome back to NucleCast. Of course, I am, as always, Adam Lowther, your host. And today we have a great guest, Dr. Wally Clark. Now, you may, if you've spent much of your career in the research and development arm of the nuclear enterprise, you would know Wally because he's been around for more than 3 decades. He's done a lot, started his career at Oak Ridge and then spent the last 2 decades with the Air Force and the last decade at the Air Force Nuclear Weapons Center. And so he's done a lot of things. And we've asked Wally to come on the show to talk about weapons effects because we never talk about weapons effects. So who better than Wally Clark? Welcome to the show, Wally, by the way.
Thanks, Adam.
But who better than Wally Clark to talk about weapons effects? So with that said, it's great to have you for the first time on NucleCast.
Well, we'll see. I mean, that's up to the listeners to see if this is enlightening, and I hope it is.
So we wanted you. You've been doing a lot of work here lately, and some series of educational podcasts on weapons effects, trying to help explain those. So for our audience, could you start off by telling us, what do we need to know about weapons effects? What are the major effects of nuclear weapons, or let's say a detonation?
Okay, so most people are familiar with conventional effects, which tend to be the blast wave, the shock wave, the overpressure that comes when you explode an air fuel bomb or any conventional weapon, even something as small as a grenade. With a nuclear weapon, you get those effects and more, mostly because you're releasing so much more energy in such a little time. So a few years ago, before I left the Air Force, I came up with an acronym to try to remember all the effects that you get. And it's called BOSTARD: blast, overpressure, shock, thermal, electromagnetics, radiation, dust. These are what I call the 7 major nuclear weapons effects. So these are the things that if you were trying to survive an effect, you'd have to make sure that you could. So before you can figure out what you need to do to survive an effect, you need to understand them. So I talked about just a second ago about how conventional weapons make BOS, blast, overpressure, shock. But a nuclear weapon makes one heck of a lot more. So let's look at this. Why do you get the blast, overpressure, and shock from a nuclear weapon? Either from a fission or a fusion weapon, you're releasing so much energy in such a short time that you'll generate a temperature like the core of the sun, maybe 10 million degrees centigrade, in a rather small volume. When you generate that much heat by fissioning all the particles in a bomb and its casing, its electronics, and its vehicle, or whether you fusion them to make helium out of the hydrogen, you're going to generate a terrific amount of heat and pressure, especially in air. In space, not really. But in air or on the ground or underground or in the water, you'll generate a massive blast wave. So this high-temperature thermonuclear weapon generates a thermal bloom and a blast wave. So the blast wave will move out at speeds of up to 2,000 miles an hour, which is appreciably faster than the speed of sound, which is around 770 miles an hour. So, in effect, if you were 10 miles from a nuclear weapon, the blast wave might get there before the sound did. Not a good day. So, accompanying the blast wave, just in front of it, is an overpressure wave, where the pressure will exceed 2 or 3 or even 10 times the normal pressure of the atmosphere, destroying buildings, no matter whether they're hardened or not. Because most buildings are hardened for the winds in the area. Consider if you lived in Florida, you want your building, your house to be hardened to hurricane force winds, which is under 200 miles an hour. Or if you live in Oklahoma, you want it to be hardened to tornado force winds, which is 350 miles an hour. This overpressure shock wave is maybe traveling upwards to 2,000 miles an hour. So no matter how you build a building, it will fail. So just after the blast wave, which is again preceded by the overpressure wave, is an underpressure wave where everything gets sucked back to the point of origin. So if you've seen any movies of bomb effects anywhere, it's mostly the ones that were taken during the above ground tests that we used to do at the Nevada test site, you'll see things move away from the blast and then get sucked back. That's the underpressure wave. And then if the bomb was low enough, you'll get a shock wave which travels through the ground. Blast, overpressure, shock. These are the effects that most people see. And by the way, when you have that blast wave go through with the overpressure and the underpressure behind it, anything in the vicinity is going to be moving. So if you've destroyed a building, then parts of the building are going to be flying around, masonry, glass, wood, etc. So if any person is in the vicinity of one of these weapons, not only will they be knocked over and just by the blast and overpressure wave, they will probably be subject to the shrapnel that is created by this. I can see you have a question.
Well, so just correct me if I'm wrong, but this blast wave, the overpressure and underpressure, that's about, when it comes to weapons effects, that's about 60% of a nuclear weapons, the effect, the devastation is about 60% from that blast wave, correct?
That's not a bad number. It's really difficult to tell. There's so much dependency on the weapon itself, the altitude of its release. Because if you think back to what the United States had to do at Nagasaki and Hiroshima, the weapons were released and detonated at thousands of feet on purpose, so as to maximize blast overpressure and shock on the ground. So that's what they got.
And in those cases, this is one of the sort of the misnomers, is because of the nature of Japanese building and construction there, paper and wood, thermal was responsible for about 80% of the damage and destruction in Hiroshima in particular. But that's not normally the case in a modern city. But thermal is that sort of second major effect from a weapon, is it not?
It is. So somewhere between 30 and 50% of the output of a nuclear weapon is X-rays. The X-rays hit the oxygen and nitrogen in the atmosphere and cause that big, massive fireball in the sky that people familiar with the old movies would equate to a nuclear blast. Then that fireball goes on to create the blast, overpressure, and shock. So it's really hard to say how much of the effect on the ground is due to any particular effect, given that they're all so well tied together. But yeah, the thermal is devastating. I mean, the fact is, you can be up to 10 miles away and suffer flash blindness. I always like to think of Arnold Schwarzenegger and Jamie Lee Curtis in the movie True Lies. And when they're kissing it, and just as a nuclear weapon goes off, and he uses his hand to cup their eyes so they won't be blinded by the flash. Let me tell you, if you're too close, the photons will go right through your skin and into your eyes. It doesn't matter whether you're looking toward it or not. And in that movie, they were too close. But, it's Hollywood.
Well, but fortunately, Hollywood, it's all real, I would assume. But you're telling me it's not, so I'll take your word for it. I'll take your word that you know more about this than Hollywood producers do. So that's the T. Was there anything else about the T in Bastard?
So it's either thermal or the flash blindness out of the T. Those are the big two. And that takes us on to electromagnetics. And that was what I worked on for way too long, electromagnetic pulse. And so here you'll get somewhere between 1 and 10%, depending on the weapon system, output in gamma rays. You get a lot of things out of the weapon. But we'll talk about the radiations in a minute. But the gamma rays will impinge on atmospheric molecules, again, the oxygen and the nitrogen, and they'll release electrons. They'll strip the electrons from the oxygen and nitrogen. And these electrons will preferentially go toward the Earth. And they'll actually travel in a spiral manner, like a corkscrew, toward the Earth. And this change in motion, this circular downward motion, actually, will generate an electromagnetic pulse. And here again, Hollywood, I'm sure that you'll be surprised by this, gets this all completely wrong. I know in a recent movie on the Black Panther, he managed to have some sort of small electromagnetic beads. Well, luckily there is no such thing, but electromagnetic pulse is really bad. And in the first podcast I did for the National Institute for Deterrence Studies, I talked about that. There's three main effects. The first effect is E1, and E1 will upset electronics. And you think about probably not your phone, probably not your car, but the cell tower, sure, it could affect that because you have a lot of electronics and a lot of metals which will act as antennas to bring this electromagnetic pulse into the electronics. This is bad. The second type of EMP, without any special name, is just called E2. You got to love that. And E2 is like lightning. And it can be a little unique, but we've had a lightning protection in buildings ever since Benjamin Franklin. So it's probably not a big effect. But the third one is called E3. Now, as when E1, it takes 10 to 20 nanoseconds. E3 goes from minutes to many minutes, up to 10 minutes. And here you have a very low voltage signal that comes down and will connect to the wires that connect the electrical systems across the world. So in the United States, we have close to 500,000 miles of electrical wire that will act as an antenna to bring this direct current signal into transformers and control systems and destroy or damage or upset the electrical system for the citizens of the United States. Of all the three, E1, E2, and E3 effects, E3 can be the one that affects most people, but E1 can upset command and control systems for the military.
Let me ask you a question about that, because I don't think I knew that. In the sense that if E3 can last as long as minutes, many minutes, how is it energetic enough to then couple on wires and then disrupt electrical systems? And I would have thought that the energy would dissipate in a faster amount of time than that. So how does it remain energetic enough that it can do that over such a long period of time?
Right. So typical long electrical line, which it's there to carry 100,000 up to 400,000 volts of alternating current. The kind of current you get in your house when you plug in your TV or microwave. The electromagnetic pulse, E3, is direct current. So, and what it is doing is it's attaching to, say, 100 miles of wire, and maybe it's only a millivolt or per mile, but now you got 100 millivolts per mile. And what it does is it'll go into the control circuits, especially the transformers in the substations or just outside your house. And instead of the electrical current going AC plus 10 volts minus 10, plus 110 volts minus 110 volts, plus 100 minus 10, minus 110, 60 times a second, now you put that DC contingent on it. So it raises the floor. So it'll go up to 210 and down to 100 and up to 300 and down to 200. And it just keeps doing that. And the transformers are not made to be hardened against this effect. Point in fact, they can be made to be hardened to this effect, but it costs more. And if you ran a company, you don't just go out and make your systems as hard as possible. You make your systems to work in the conditions that you expect. And to quote Monty Python, nobody expects, or to misquote them, nobody expects an EM pulse to disrupt their transformers. Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
Well, we're at the time where we have to take a quick break, and when we get back, you're going to finish that. We're at the BOSTE. We've got the RD left, and then maybe if we've got some time, we can talk about balanced survivability, which is kind of an important question. So we're talking to Dr. Wally Clark. We're talking about weapons effects, and we'll be right back. This episode of NucleCast is brought to you by the ANWA Deterrence Center, whose mission is to educate Americans about the nuclear enterprise and strategic deterrence. And we're back, and we're talking to Wally Clark. And Wally, we've got blast and overpressure and shock. We've got thermal. And then we've just talked about the electromagnetic pulse. Was there anything else about that pulse, or were we ready to move on?
Well, so in electromagnetics, there's a few other things, to static discharge, the electricity will be there to statically charge any of the remaining particles from the weapon system or any dust that's in the air. And the only EMP we talked about was the one that we're most familiar with, the one that's deleterious, but there's a half a dozen others. I will tell you, the one that scares me the most is what's called enhanced EMP. And there is a thing you can do when you build the weapon to make it produce many more gamma particles. The gamma particles that strip the electrons from the atmosphere that make the EMP. Some people call this enhanced EMP weapons. Some call it a super EMP weapons. The Chinese say they have such a weapon. They say it. More so, the Taiwanese agree that the Chinese have an enhanced EMP weapon. And the Chinese say that they could use these, and they would use these in any attack on Taiwan. So how bad would it be if the entire island of Taiwan were to lose all electrical generation capabilities? It would be bad for them, of course, because they'd lose command, control, communications, radar, who knows what else. It'd be bad for us because a lot of our microcircuits come from Taiwan, and you don't shut down a microcircuit factory. Enhanced EMP is bad. Then there's other kinds. There's actually a source region EMP. Think about this. If you have a weapon go off at a low enough altitude near electrical lines, it will generate EMP in the source region. Right there, the gamma rays come out, strip the electrons from the atmosphere, generate the spiraling, corkscrewing electrons, which go to a nearby wire. The wire picks it up, carries it off somewhere to affect electrical and electronic systems at range. And the wire has already taken the signal by the time the blast wave gets there and destroys the original part of the wire. EMP used to be studied a lot, and we tried to harden our systems to it, but not so much anymore. So there's more on the electromagnetics, but that's enough for now.
Well, let me ask you a sort of a, because whenever I was the director of SANS, we were at Kirtland and would spend some time at Sandia. And I remember where they would do the electromagnetic pulse test at Sandia. So I just wonder, I'm thinking like KC-46, for example, the new tanker. I don't think that aircraft is hardened for an EM pulse. And so I sort of wonder, are we doing what we did during the Cold War to prepare for such an eventuality?
So without getting in trouble from the classification police, I will say no, we're not.
Yeah.
It was funny in the last few years of my career, I was pushing for more survivability for our weapon systems, and I went out to talk to the folks at Patuxent River Naval Air Station about how they tested their aircraft for survivability to electromagnetics, and it's really neat. The Navy tests every aircraft they get, not one of every kind, every one. And they have a deal with all the aircraft manufacturers. If the system, if the plane survives all their tests, it's accepted into the inventory. And if it fails, they call up the manufacturer and tell them to come pick up their damn plane. So I was out there talking to them about how they did their tests, and we went over it. And they said, "Well, Wally, how come you're asking us these questions? After all, we all used to work for you." The Air Force was the preeminent EMP test facility in the world in the 70s and the 80s at Kirtland Air Force Base, at the dipole facilities and at what is called the trestle.
Yeah.
But we haven't, the Air Force hasn't been active in that for decades. And it's a shame. I wish we were. It is given a military mission. If you were exposed to a weapon system, you want to be able to survive to complete the mission. Maybe not return to base, maybe not have electricity on when you get to base, but you need to survive the mission. And testing for EMP would make your systems, you would have a better understanding of their survivability, and then you could do whatever you needed to do to fix them. But no, in my opinion, the Air Force doesn't do enough. The Navy does, and therefore the Marine does. The Army, I do not know.
Yeah. So we're at the BOSTE. So what's left of our
radiation? BOSTERD. So radiation, there's a lot. You get a lot of alpha particles and a lot of alpha, beta, gamma, neutrons, and X-rays. That's what comes out. The alphas are helium neutrons. So two protons. The helium nuclei. So two neutrons, two protons. They interact with anything that they see. So their mean free path, or the time before they're absorbed, is seconds in the atmosphere. Beta particles are electrons. So if they're electrons that were just stripped, maybe they're part of the EMP. And if not, again, they're so reactive, they'll find a local nucleus and grab hold right away.
So those alpha particles, for example, they're the least dangerous because, they'll be stopped by skin, for example. Yeah, paper. So like when we hear about people, the Russians like to poison, and they use alpha generators to poison, but the only way for that to be really bad is you have to ingest it.
Yeah, you have to either breathe it or ingest it. So,
So,
and
okay.
the same can be said for betas. Then comes gamma. Well, we know what some of the gammas did. Other gammas do things like the gamma knife for helping to with cancer surgeries inside people. This is where you focus gammas into a point. Gammas are rather nasty because they go through a lot of matter, and then when they get to where they're going, they will be injected or inject themselves into the nucleus of an atom. And when they do that, there's a huge energy jump in the nucleus. The nucleus will then either eject gammas at a lower energy, or the nucleus may split into two other atoms, and then you might get a cascade tunneling effect in a piece of material or in a piece of tissue. And then there's neutrons. Neutrons do the same thing to tissue and material as the gammas, only 10 times worse. The problem here with neutrons is that they'll go through almost anything. They're neutral. They have nothing to react with. But when they hit something, let's say a piece of electronics, the neutron will go in. If it manages to impinge on an atom inside, the atom will split into two parts, and then those two parts will proceed in the same general direction as the original neutron, and they may hit other atoms and cause yet more and more splitting. A lot of this is going to be dependent on the energy of the initial neutron, but coming out of a nuclear weapon, it can be pretty high.
Yeah.
So that's the radiations.
And that's the ones, the gamma and the neutron, that's what we're most concerned about. What's most dangerous for people,
Absolutely.
electronics. Yeah. That's the
Well,
residual.
remember the neutron bomb.
Yeah.
Well, maybe you don't. You're so much younger. So there was during the Jimmy Carter as president era, there was work being done somewhere by somebody in the United States on fabricating neutron bombs. And the thought was here you would put much more of the energy of the weapon into neutron production versus X-rays, which go into a big part of your thermal fireball. And the neutrons would kill people, but not necessarily destroy infrastructure.
Yeah. That's what, if I recall correctly, those neutron bombs, when we wanted to wipe out the Soviets but not their tanks and other things, that's what the neutron bomb was for. Yeah. Okay, so was there anything else about radiation that the listeners needed to know?
I think those are the big parts.
And then we have prompt radiation that, that's sort of that instant that the bomb it detonates and, that radiation's released. That's the really bad stuff you don't want to be around right then at that, you want to be at a minimum safe distance that allows you to be outside that blast zone and, that zone of radiation. And then we often worry about residual radiation. Can you maybe give us a little bit about prompt ionizing versus residual radiation?
So you've got the correct words. The prompt radiation is that which is released within the first minute, and this is the stuff where you're going to have the some of the radionucleotide leftovers from the weapon system and its carrier will mix with, depending on the altitude, the dust in the air, the water, the pollution, the smog, and impart their radioactivity onto these other material. So the prompt radiation comes out within the first minute, and you're right. That's the stuff you don't want to be around. You don't want to be within 10 miles of ground zero. Hell, I don't want to be on the Earth of 10-0, but ground zero. But you don't want to be within 10 miles. And even then you want to be inside, and even then you don't want to go outside for 36 hours, depending on the wind location. But that prompt radiation is really bad. The gammas and the neutrons, and indeed some of the X-rays, if you're within range, will do very nasty things to your body. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, People who were just fine for the first week, after a week later, because of the exposure to the prompt radiation, got sick and died in horrible, painful deaths. Terrible, terrible thing. That's the prompt. But the residual radiation, which you get from where the molecules of the bomb casing or anything that touched the dust in the air, this is where you get the fallout, so called because the material falls out of the sky for weeks, months, or years. Point in fact that there's radioactive material, plutonium, in ice cores in the South Pole. And you'd say, well, that's how did it get there? Well, we have evidence that it got there after all the above ground tests, 650 or so that were conducted worldwide in the above ground tests. But you go into the ice cores, you can see this radioactive plutonium. And the interesting thing about plutonium, it has a half-life of 24,000 years. So it'll be here for a while.
Yeah.
If you happen to be in an area where you had some of this radioactivity falling on you and fallout, that could be really, really bad. Again, if you ingest it is the worst, but sometimes just exposure can be bad.
Yeah. And then the final one was dust, right? That was our
Dust.
D in Boston. Yeah.
Yeah, I had never really considered dust to be a bad thing when I first got into this study. And then I was talking with a fellow named Brett Bordeaux, and he said, well, what about dust? And I said, well, what's the big deal? Well, look at this. 100,000 tons of dust from the Sahara Desert is deposited yearly into the Amazon, and trade winds that come from Africa over to the Amazon. That means there's dust in the air. There's dust in the air from from the fires in Canada. There's dust in the air from smog, from agriculture. There's dust in the air. So a weapon goes off. Doesn't matter what altitude, there's going to be dust. Now, a lower altitude detonation is going to give you a lot more dust. Not a good thing. Not only because you're now imparting, I'm going to backtrack a little bit, of radioactivity directly into the ground and the things that are there, but because you're going to generate yet more dust. And this dust can travel around the world in as little as 4 days. You think about a nuclear fireball, the mushroom cloud, dust will be sucked up through the stem and into the mushroom cap. And then once it reaches 3 or 4 miles altitude, the dust will be carried by trade winds and jet streams around the world in as little as 4 days. And the dust will be everywhere. So that means that we're all breathing dust from everywhere else in the world right now. But why is dust so bad? So you're in a jet engine. Say you're flying your mission, or you're just flying from Albuquerque to Chicago. That jet engine is picking up dust all the time. That dust will form little tiny craters in the engine, because the jet engine, the parts are spinning really fast. So you'll get little tiny craters formed, or it'll clog the filters in the airplane. The air that you're breathing might be coming from outside, or it might be electrostatically charged and then just stick to the airplane, which will add to its weight, or it might be radioactive. So you can have dust that's radioactive, electrostatically charged, sticking to the aircraft, clogging your filters. Dust is everywhere, and it's in all nuclear effects. It's even in the blast overpressure and shock. After all, as that air is moving along the ground at up to 2,000 miles an hour, it's carrying a big load of dust. So you have blast, overpressure, shock, thermal, electromagnetics, radiation, and dust. And we have barely scratched the surface.
Man, unfortunately, we're out of time. But, before we go, I wanted, when you said dust, I taught in, the University in Arkansas, and there was a professor at the University of Arkansas who would measure, he was a nuclear physicist, and he knew when all of Russia's tests occurred, and he knew a great deal about them because the jet stream, he had his measuring equipment, and the jet stream would come right through, the Fayetteville area, and he would capture it in his filters, and he would know exactly what had gone on, at Russian nuclear tests in, Kazakhstan, just because of how that dust travels, like you said, around the world. So it really is kind of an important thing. And I hadn't really thought about it being that important until you just said that. So thanks for that. Well, Wally, we never got to talk about balanced survivability. So what we'll have to do is on another episode, you got to come back, because this has been really an informative episode. Hopefully the listeners, remember your bastard, and you'll remember your weapons effects. Remember blast, overpressure, shock, thermal, electromagnetic, radiation, and dust. Bastard. And you can think about the weapons effects through that. So thanks for coming on, Wally. I appreciate it. Yeah, thanks for talking about an important topic. And of course, next time we're going to talk about survivability. We have to worry about, I mentioned the KC-46. You can't refuel aircraft if they can't survive. The bombers can't fly into, in an area where there's been a detonation. It's such an important thing. So that'll be a topic I'll look forward to. All right. Well,
I hope to come back and help.
Oh yeah, you will, for sure. So thanks to all the listeners. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to Wally Clark for coming on and talking about weapons effects. And of course, I never thank Kimberly, our producer. So thanks to all the work that Kim does to help make the show a great show. And thanks to you, the listeners, of course. And we will see you on the next episode of Nuclecast. Interesting episode with Wally Clark. So the bastard, I've always thought about, blast and overpressure and shock is sort of one thing. And then thermal is one thing. And then, prompt ionizing radiation is one thing. And so I'd sort of seen it, thought about weapons effects as those three things. And so for Wally to break it out into the bastard and then, to add the EMP and the dust, that was pretty useful and interesting. And then just, I thought the way he explained it was pretty informative. So hopefully he didn't talk over folks' head. If this is weapons effects are not something you think about or know much about, hopefully you'll find that, simple enough, straightforward enough. And hopefully, you have a better sense of how nuclear weapons, what those effects are.
This has been a production of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Our executive producer is Kimberly Charrington, and this episode has been engineered and mixed by David Krumthal. Follow the show on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at Nuclecast. Listen, follow, and review the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.